It's good to see all of you. Once you get your Bible, Numbers chapter 15 is where we are going to be at this morning, and we are continue our study through the book of Numbers, and along with that is the story of redemption, the story of faith, God saving his people from Egypt, leading them home, leading them to the promised land. And in chapter 14, just the previous chapter, we found out that the children of Israel, they were not obedient to God. They were disobedient, and they were supposed to enter into the promised land by faith. Their journey was going to be over. They're in the promised land. Well, they got to the border, and they freaked out because they looked in and saw that there were giants in the land, that there were people, warriors in there, and they decided, we're not going to trust God because we see these warriors. They were fearful. And there were 10 guys who were fearful. And they influenced the rest of the Jews, the rest of God's people. And so the people decided, we're not going in. And that was a huge, huge blow. And what happened was that God said to them at that point, okay, if you're not going in, then here's what we'll do. Now, there were millions of people out there, God's people. And God said at that point, he said, listen, if you're not going to, by faith, you're not going to trust me, you're not going to go in, that's fine. He says, you're not going to go in. The people will not go in for 40 years. He says, what I'm going to do is anybody that's 20 years and older, I'm going to march you around the wilderness for 40 years until you die. You will never go into the promised land. He says, and then what we'll do at that point is I'll take that younger generation, those that were 19 and younger at the time, and then they would grow, they'd all be adults. And then at that point, 40 years later, he would take that bunch of younger people, as they've grown, he would take them into the promised land. Well, as you can imagine, some of the people were really bummed out because they realized at that point, like, man, we had an opportunity to trust God, and we didn't. You know how sometimes that happens where you're faced with some challenging situation, and you feel like, you know what, I just need to trust God. And then you mess up, and you don't trust God. You don't live by faith. And afterwards, you can feel so guilty, like, oh, man, God was giving me a shot just to live for him, to make a decision for him, and I didn't do it. I was ashamed. And you feel so guilty. Well, they felt the same thing, and what they did afterwards was they said, there was a big group of them who said, listen, we messed up, Moses, but we're gathered up some people, we're going into the promised land, we're going to take over. And at that point, Moses says, no, it's too late. You can't go into the promised land now. God already said you can't go in. You wouldn't go in the first time, so now God says you can't go in. So if you go, Moses warns them, if you go, you're going to go without God. He's not going with you. And it's going to be disastrous. Well, they went anyways. They decided they felt so guilty that they were going to try to make things right with God by forcing themselves into the promised land. And sure enough, the warriors that were in the land came against them, chased them out of the land. And now you can imagine that they are just feeling so down, so bummed out. Well, here's what God does in Numbers chapter 15. There are three main divisions for those that take notes. There is the offerings. We've talked about offerings a lot, okay? Things change a little bit, or there's something added to those offerings, so this is something new that we'll go through it pretty quickly. And then there are offenses. We're told about offenses without offerings. Hello, test. Okay, sorry about that. Gotta quit smoking. Offenses without offering. I'm just kidding, I don't smoke. Okay, offerings. Offenses without offerings. So there are some offenses that there are no offerings for. No going back. And then we'll talk about outward appearance, something that we do not often talk about. So I hope that you wore the right thing this morning, because if not, I'm coming for you. Just kidding. Offerings. Let's look at that real briefly, verses 1 through 29. Look at verse 1, and the Lord spoke to Moses. And here's what he said in verse 2. It's God speaking. God says, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you have come into the land. Now this is a great promise, a great reminder. You will go into the promised land. It'll be the younger people. But once you as a nation go into the promised land, that's a great promise. Yeah, the older people have blown it. But you younger people, you're going in. Okay? And here's what he does beginning in verse 3. He's going to tell them about offerings. Now, some of you that have been here for a little while, and you've been through Leviticus with us, it's tough to get through, but we did it. You're right now, you're thinking, but we've already talked about offerings, man. I know. We spent a lot of time talking about offerings, burnt offerings, and all the different types of offerings. Well, these are those same offerings. However, he's going to add something to that. So hold tight. We'll look at it briefly. But first, he's going to tell them about offerings. If you are giving an offering to fulfill a vow, you made a vow, and now you're going to fulfill that vow. Or if you're just making a free will offering, like, you know what? I just really love God, and I just really appreciate him, and I want to sacrifice. I want to offer something to him. You know, you're not in trouble, I just want to give. Or if it's one of the feasts. They had feasts that God had given them, assigned to them, and they were required to celebrate these feasts. I love that. Now, nobody needs to, I'm not required to celebrate Thanksgiving, but I mean, man, we love that, right? It's like I guess for some of you, if you're not there, you will get hit with mom's chancla, right? You better show up. Like, you're required. But in this sense, God required them to celebrate these feasts. He says, if you're making offerings for any of these things, you're going to add something to it. Now, we'll get to that in just a second. Sorry. There's two things that you're going to add to these offerings. You're going to give your burnt offering, okay? Verse 3. And if you make an offering by fire to the Lord, a burnt offering or a sacrifice, to fulfill a vow or as a free will offering or in your appointed feast, to make a sweet aroma to the Lord. Look at verse 4. Then he who presents his offering to the Lord shall bring a grain offering. And then in verse 5, and 1/4 of a hin of wine as a drink offering. So to the offerings that some of us are already familiar with, they were to add a grain offering along with that. So there was this animal sacrifice, meat, and then they were to take some grain, prepare that, and add that to the offering, and then also some wine. Now you see this idea of this entire meal set out, and it's you and God now having this fellowship over this meal. It's a pretty cool picture. But there's a phrase in here that's a key phrase. Notice at the end of verse 3, to make a sweet aroma to the Lord. If you go down to verse 7, at the end of verse 7, as a sweet aroma to the Lord. Look at the end of verse 10, a sweet aroma to the Lord. Guess what we find in verse 13 at the end? A sweet aroma to the Lord. You want one more? I'll give it to you anyways. Verse 14, a sweet aroma to the Lord. So God was concerned that these items be added so that, obviously, it would create this sweet aroma to the Lord. Now, what is that all about? Does God he really wants to smell something? Now, keep in mind, these things were to be added when they get into the promised land. They were to add these things. Perhaps because these things would be more readily available, right? Wine and grain. Okay, maybe on the road you don't have a lot of access to those things. But what is the deal with the sweet aroma? Why is God so concerned with that? Well, there is, obviously, God says himself, a sweet aroma to the Lord. So he wants to be able to smell it. He likes the mixtures of the smells. We're the same way, right? When your mom is making your favorite meal, or maybe your dad is making your favorite meal. Maybe it's your grandma or whatever. You go to your grandma's house, and as you're walking out, or you walk in, and you can just smell, oh man, she made her mac and cheese, or she made my grandma's house. It was always a pot of beans, fresh beans. De olla, they call them, just in the pot, and not out of the can. You walk in, you smell that, or maybe it's some other smell. And that brings about sweet memories. Even now, and my smell is not that good. My smell's kind of jacked up. Has been for several years, not just because of COVID. But it's been messed up for a long time. But still, there are things that if I smell them, it evokes memories and takes me right back to some time in the past. Does that happen to any of you, where you smell something and then you're like, yeah, all of a sudden, I had this memory. I remember this. maybe from your childhood. Those are, some good memories, right? When times were easy, man, and, maybe it takes you right back to when you used to just play with your Barbies, or your Legos, or you'd be outside playing or climbing trees, whatever. Those smells can invoke those memories, stir up those memories. Well, for God, he says, I want to smell these things. Okay, it's a sweet aroma. But also, it would have been, it would have created sweet memories in the hearts and the minds of the people also. That as they smell the sacrifices being burnt, and they smell the grain offering and the wine and these things, the mixture of it all, they would smell that, and it would be good memories. Oh, that's right, we have a relationship with God, and their sacrifices going up, and man, what a sweet thing. And it's a great reminder. Now, first service didn't get this. I'm giving you something special, because I like you guys better. Do you believe that? Yeah, totally. Those sweet aromas. It's a great reminder that the sacrifices that we make to the Lord, we don't do animal sacrifices anymore, or you better not be. The sacrifices that we make, what does Romans chapter 12 tell us? To present your bodies as a living what? You're like, what is Romans? Present your bodies as a living sacrifice. When you and I give our lives to the Lord, it's a sweet aroma to the Lord. Isn't that a cool thought? What a great thought. That as I sacrifice for God and unto God, that it becomes a sweet smell to him. And I would even add that it becomes a sweet smell to everybody around you. And they can't literally smell your sacrifice, but you're a pleasure to be around for many people. As you're living for the Lord, you're becoming sweeter and sweeter, not more sour. As you're serving the Lord, you're becoming sweeter, a sweeter person. And then that is a blessing to everybody around you. And that becomes, in a sense, this sweet aroma. So it was for these people. It's a sweet aroma to the Lord, but also the other people in the camp would smell it and go, oh, that's right. We belong to the Lord, man. What a good life it was. Even though they were in a little bit of trouble here and not allowed to go into the promised land, still, they didn't lose their relationship with God. They still belong to God. What a great thing. That even when you and I make mistakes, or we're disobedient to God, or we're not living by faith, or we fail and we fall short, doesn't mean that we lose our relationship with God. That remains. And yeah, we messed up, but God gives forgiveness and restoration, but we still belong to God. What a wonderful thing. There was another thing about these offerings. He says, when you get into the land, beginning at verse 17, going down to verse 21, I want you to bring the first of the ground meal. The first of the ground meal. Verse 18, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land to which I bring you, there's the promise again. Then it will be, when you eat of the bread of the land, that you shall offer up a heave offering to the Lord. Verse 20, you shall offer up a cake. Ooh, now we're talking. Of your first ground meal. In other words, as you get into the promised land and you harvest the grain and you decide that you're going to make some bread for your family, God says, I want the first loaf. You bring me the first cake of bread. Now, this was, again, a test of faith. I really need to feed my family with this bread. But God's requiring it from me. So I bring it to God by faith. As I present it to God, I believe that God is going to take my bread, but he's also going to present me more. He's going to provide more for me. So it's an act of faith. A relationship with God has always been by faith, even in the Old Testament. It wasn't about the rules and the commandments and all. They had all of those things, but it was still about a relationship. If you just followed the rules, but you didn't have, your heart was not invested, then it's no good. Then you're just doing things. We want to have our hearts invested. It's always been by faith. Now, he goes on to tell us about offerings for unintentional sin. Man, I didn't know. I messed up. Verse 22. If you sin unintentionally and do not observe all these commandments, which the Lord has spoken to Moses. Verse 24, then it will be, if it is unintentionally committed without the knowledge of the congregation. In other words, the entire group, they just didn't realize that they were sinning. That the whole congregation shall offer one young bull as a burnt offering, and here it is again, as a sweet aroma to the Lord, with its grain offering, its drink offering, according to the ordinance, and one kid of the goats as a sin offering. So that was for unintentional sin. If they sinned unintentionally, they weren't aware, they didn't realize. Verse 25, the priest will make atonement for the whole congregation. Look at verse 26. It shall be forgiven. Verse 27. And if a person, it talks about the individual. Maybe it's not the entire population, but maybe it's just one individual, sins unintentionally. Then he shall bring a female goat in its first year as a sin offering. Now, we've read in here about the bulls, and now it's a kid of the goats, and now it's a female goat. Was there something special or magical about the animal itself? No. Again, it's by faith. Why a goat? Why a female goat? Why a kid? Why a baby goat? Why a bull? For these specific areas. Why? Is it because there was something special about the animal? No. It's what God prescribed. This is how I want you to do it. And so by faith, I show up and I've got my goat and I say, my female goat, hey, I sinned unintentionally. Here's a female goat. The female goat is just a female goat. Why? What's special about this goat? Nothing really, but it's what God prescribed. This is what he wants. Keep in mind that God is teaching his people how to conduct themselves, how to live. And he's been addressing every single area of their lives, and he's conditioning the people. That is true. He's brainwashing them, washing their brains. They've been thinking like slaves, and he's trying to show them how to live like free people, like followers of God, children of God. And he's conditioning them as they see a sacrificial animal generation after generation. Eventually, here comes Jesus, God's Son, the Messiah. He sacrifices himself, and then they go, oh, he's the Lamb of God, animal sacrifice, blood sacrifice. We know all about this. We've learned that for generations in Leviticus and Exodus and in Numbers and all. We know about this. So then they would recognize, oh, Jesus is the sacrificial lamb, and they would surrender their lives to Jesus. So he's conditioning them. And so he's telling them here, listen, you'll be forgiven. You do what I'm telling you to do, you'll be forgiven. But look at this in verse 30. We move on to the second main division, offenses without offerings. Offenses. This is scary. Presumptuous sin, verse 30. But the person who does anything presumptuously. What does presumptuously mean? Does anybody know? Anybody good at English? And anybody know what presumptuously means? Presumptuously means, yeah, I know the rules, but I'm going to do my own thing anyways. Remember when Matt was up here a few minutes ago and he was introducing that new song? Anybody remember that? You're like, where was I a few minutes ago? Remember he was introducing a new song? And he talked about how we don't like people that tell us what to do. Right? That's us, man. You don't tell me what to do. I do what I want to do. You don't tell me what kind of shirt to wear. I'm wear whatever shirt I want to wear. You don't tell me what shoes to wear. I'm wear whatever kind of. You don't tell me what to watch on TV. I watch whatever I want on TV. Right? We're like that. And a big part of that is because, man, we're Americans. You don't tell us what to do. The British tried that once. Look what we did to them. Threw all their tea in the harbor, man. We did what we wanted to do. We're Americans. Right? There's part of that. I mean, part of it is just my flesh, just my own human nature. Like, man, you don't tell me what to do. I'll do what I want to do. But then there's that other part of us like, no, we're Americans, man. You know what? You don't tell us what to do, man. We're punk rock, man. We just live how we want to live. And there's that nature in us. And that would be this individual. But the person who does anything presumptuously, there's that person that just says, listen, I know what the rules are, but forget your rules. I'm doing what I want to do. He says, but the person who does anything presumptuously, in verse 30, whether he is a native born or a stranger, that one brings reproach on the Lord. He brings shame on the Lord. He shall, because these are God's people. They're God's people, so you can't have one dude over here like doing his own thing, being disobedient, flagrantly disobeying God. He says that one brings reproach on the Lord, and he shall be cut off from among his people. Cut off. Verse 31, because he has despised the word of the Lord. He's hated the word of God and has broken his commandment. That person shall be completely cut off. His guilt shall be upon him. What God just said about this presumptuous sin is that there is no offering for that. You go, but wait a minute, I thought God was forgiving, and I thought that he was, merciful and, gentle and all those things. He is. But this is dealing with an individual who has that rebelliousness in his or her heart, and there's no way they're going to turn. They're just like, you know what, God, I see you over there, and I see your rules, I hear all that, but I don't care. I'm doing my own thing, and I'm not obeying you. And we're familiar with that type of person. We have lots of those people in our society. That's the greater part of our society is they're people who don't want to live in obedience to God, and they hear about God and they say that's just that's old, and that's old-fashioned. We don't want to have anything to do with that. We don't want to listen to that, and they want to do their own thing. They want to live how they want to live. That's what this is all about here. I want to make that distinction, because some of us, there are times when you and I will struggle and we will deliberately disobey God. There are those times. But that's not who God is talking about here. This is an individual that's living like that all of the time. There's no struggle like, oh, I really want to obey God, but I'm going to disobey. No, it's the individual who just says, I don't even want to obey God, I'm only going to disobey. And God says for that individual, there is no offering. That individual must be cut off. And then, beginning in verse 32, we are given an example, a story, relating to that presumptuous sin. And it's harsh. Look at verse 32. Now, while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. Now, first of all, what is the Sabbath day? Can anybody tell me what the Sabbath day is?
Saturday.
It's a Saturday. And what does that mean, that it was the Sabbath day? What was so special about that?
It's the day of rest.
Yes. And they were supposed to do what on the Sabbath day?
They weren't supposed to work.
Thank you very much. They weren't supposed to do anything. They were actually supposed to God told them, don't do anything on the Sabbath. I just want you to spend time with me. That's not hard at all. Why wouldn't I want to spend a day with God? That sounds great. That sounds fantastic. And it also sounds to me, it's funny because it starts out sounding so innocent. Here's a guy out there, as they're in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks because, what do you do in the wilderness? You got no Wi-Fi signal. I mean, how many times can you go through your pictures, right? So what else are you going to do? You gather sticks. It just sounds like, this is a sweet guy he's just picking up sticks. How like when you were a little kid, right? And maybe your family went on a hike or something, and you'd pick up rocks, or, oh, I just want to collect rocks, Mom, and your mom's like, no, just throw those rocks away. Because by the end of the hike, man, you got like your pocket's full. I can't even walk. I got too many rocks, This just sounds like a sweet little guy. He's just picking up sticks. What's the big deal? Well, obviously there's something greater going on here. And that'll become very, very obvious here, but as he's gathering sticks on the Sabbath day, not supposed to do anything, any kind of work. Verse 33 says, and those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. Snitches. Right? That's what we think. Snitches. Tattletales. Verse 34, they put him under guard because it had not been explained what should be done to him. Like, man, I was just picking up sticks and now I'm in jail? Really? There's something bigger going on. Because, how do we know that? Because maybe he's just picking up sticks. Well, verse 35, God didn't think he was just picking up sticks as a hobby. Because in verse 35, then the Lord said to Moses, the man must surely be put to death. What? For collecting sticks? Yeah. You're going to remember this the next time you go camping. Mom or dad or uncle, whoever, like, hey, go gather up some of those sticks. We need a little bit of firewood. You're like, no, I'm not touching those sticks, man. What day is it? Saturday? No. Friday night, sundown. Sabbath goes from Friday night, sundown, all day Saturday. And it's going to be like Friday night camping. Hey, go give me some of those sticks over there. Like, nope. What's wrong with you? No, I'm not touching those sticks, man. I'm not going anywhere. You can touch them if you want. But here God says, no, this man must surely be put to death. And he says in verse 35, here's how it's supposed to happen. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. They were required. God says, you got to take him outside the camp. And everybody from the congregation, the people, the population, they got to pick up rocks and throw them at this guy until he dies. You got to kill him that way. Judgment. Wow. Why? Because God had said in verse 31, because he has despised the word of the Lord. He's broken his commandment. He brought reproach on the Lord. He brought shame to the Lord. And God says this cannot happen. You see, what happens is, if he allows this guy to get away with it, then the neighbor is going to say, oh, well, if he can gather sticks, I can gather sticks on the Sabbath. And then the next neighbor is going to say, well, if those two can gather sticks on the Sabbath, I can gather sticks on the Sabbath. Well, if they can do, well, then I can do that. Well, and so God has to deal harshly with it here at the beginning. You've seen examples of this sometimes at home. If you're the oldest in the family and you get in trouble, sometimes mom or dad, they come down. Now they drop the hammer. And you're like, really? Like, why are you being so harsh? Like, why are you judging me so harshly? But in their minds, if they do not judge you, discipline you, you've got younger brothers or younger sisters that are going to do the same and probably get worse. So they use you as the example. Hurts. But this is the payment for disobedience. So in verse 36, as the Lord commanded Moses, all the congregation, now in English, all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died. Wow. But you see, we're in the book of Numbers, right? The book before Numbers was called what? Anybody remember? Leviticus. What was the book before Leviticus?
Exodus.
Yes. Did you know that back in Exodus 31, verse 14, God said, you shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. So God had already made his rule clear. This guy presumptuously sinned. He said, yeah, I heard that back in Exodus 31, but I'm doing my own thing. You don't tell me what to do. And he went ahead and he did it. God had already given the rule. This guy broke it. Now, I do need to say this. The lesson here is that we don't want to live in disobedience to God because there's payment for that. Again, in the book of Romans, we're told that the wages of sin, the payment for sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life. So there's payment. But I do need to say this, that of all of the commandments, this is one of the commandments, like one of the 10 commandments. Of all the commandments, so there's 10, well, there's lots more commandments, but 10 commandments, but all that goes along with that. All of them are repeated in the New Testament, except for one. Does anybody know which commandment is not repeated in the New Testament for Christians? Anybody? Anybody want to take a wild guess? What are we talking about here? Which? Yeah.
The first commandment?
What's that?
First commandment?
Not the first commandment. Nope. Yes? Yeah, that's it. How'd you guess that? Man, that was good. That was awesome. Yeah, the only one that's not repeated for Christians in the New Testament is the Sabbath rule. We don't, Jesus, we're told, and this is a discussion for a different day, but Jesus has become our Sabbath. So if we have Jesus, there's not a specific day that we have to observe God. In fact, we as Christians, here we are on Sunday. Many of us will be back on Wednesday night again, troublemakers. You're supposed to only have one day. Well, we want Sunday and Monday and Tuesday, and give us Wednesday too. You know what? As a matter of fact, we'll take Thursday and then Friday if there's a Bible study, and then Saturday. See, we want to praise the Lord we want to belong to the Lord every single day. But this guy already knew this, and so he suffers because he was flagrantly sinning against God. He was presumptuous. Now, outward appearance. This is something that we don't get to talk about often, but keep in mind that what God is doing is he's teaching his people how to live. He's teaching his people how to live. And he's addressing every area of their lives. Remember, he even had rules for their romantic lives, their intimate lives. You know, and he was very particular about all of those things, and he's still particular, and now he actually addresses their clothing. Verse 37, again the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a blue thread in the tassels of the corners. So they were to now make, their clothing was to be different from everybody else that they lived nearby. Their clothing, though it may have looked like everybody else's, they were to distinguish themselves or their clothing by putting tassels on the corners of their clothing. Now, this is not necessarily a piece of clothing. This is a prayer scarf. We wouldn't consider this clothing. I guess we could, you know. It's a part of the fit, so maybe you would. But this is a prayer scarf. Now, what you will see sometimes is that to this day, there are people that are called like Orthodox Jews, Jewish people, Orthodox Jews, who still practice Judaism. And you'll see these things sometimes. Sometimes you'll see these prayer shawls, and you might see pictures of people in Israel at the Wailing Wall, and they'll have this thing over them, and they're praying. Oftentimes they're holding these things praying, the tassels. But what is more common, or what you would see more commonly, is that they'll actually take something like this and make it into like a poncho, like a mini poncho. Okay? It's got a hole in it, you know. You just put it like the ones you get in Mexico, just poncho. They would actually make these into a poncho that's not this long, and it would actually just go under their clothing. And they might wear this, and you might see it just kind of sticking out, you know, under their shirt as they walk around. And they might have a jacket on or whatever. Oftentimes you'll see the Orthodox Jews in all black, like a black sport coat, black vest, white shirt, and then you'll see this sticking out. It's like, what is that? Are their clothes coming apart? Like, what's wrong with this shirt? You know, what's going on? And so many of them still practice this to this day. That's what that's all about. And so they would have these tassels. We'll find out why in just a moment. But they were also, God also tells them to put blue thread in there. Why? Why blue thread? Does anybody know? Me either. He doesn't say. People have all kinds of ideas about why blue, but he doesn't say. He just said put blue in there. And so God says to them, here's the reason why they were to put tassels on the corners of their clothing. Verse 39. And you shall have the tassel, that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord. So that as my clothing has, you know, these little tassels on the four corners, and I'm outside plowing my field, or I'm going to the marketplace, and I see these tassels, I'm reminded, oh, that's right, I belong to God. Everything about their lives was to be a reminder, and now even their clothing was to be a reminder. That you may look upon it and remember all the commandments. These tassels were reminders. That you would remember all the commandments. Maybe I go to the convenience store at the corner, and I'm like, oh man, Mom sent me to get some OJ. But I really want some Twinkies. The guy's not really paying attention. I think I can get these Twinkies, stick them in my pocket. Yeah, they'll be smashed, but they'll still taste the same. And I can just skip town and go eat my Twinkies on the way home. And then as you're grabbing the Twinkies, looking around, it's like, okay, man, the cameras aren't hitting me. And you go to put that in your pocket and you go, oh, I got tassels. I belong to God. I can't steal these Twinkies. I guess mom doesn't get her orange juice. And then, so then you would remember, like, oh, that's right, I belong to God, man, that's right. That's the idea here. He says that you would remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and that you may not follow the harlotry to which your own heart and your own eyes are inclined. Harlotry, what does that mean? Harlotry is like prostitution. You go, wait, what's he talking about here? That you may not follow the harlotry or the prostitution to which your own heart and your own eyes are inclined? Did you know that the book of Isaiah says that the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked? That's God's description of the human heart. So you and I have got to be careful. Man, when we're watching our favorite Disney movie, and they're telling us, you just got to follow your own heart. That could be dangerous. If my heart is deceitful and desperately wicked, then my heart can lead me astray. Now, if my heart has Jesus in it and Jesus is ruling my heart, and then I follow my heart, that's fine, because in reality I'm following Jesus. I'm doing what Jesus wants me to do. But if I'm not submitted to Jesus, then I can get myself into some real trouble. I've got to be careful with that. Got to be careful with that. But here, what he's talking about, this harlotry or this prostitution, he says, when you come into the land, they're going to have false gods, false idols. These people have already been mixed up in that. And they very easily go astray and follow idols. They worship other gods, false gods. And he says, you got to have these reminders. Everything has got to be a reminder, so that if you're getting ready to bow down in front of some false god, some idol, and then all of a sudden here comes your tassel, you're like, wait a minute, I belong to God. I'm not supposed to be here worshiping this idol. I got to get myself out of here. And you split. That's the idea, is that this was a practical reminder to keep your heart from doing what it's inclined to do. Our heart already wants to be disobedient to God. It already wants to naturally. So we need all the help that we can get. And that's where sometimes Christian t-shirts, with a Christian message, or maybe a bracelet or something with a verse on it, those things can be very, very handy. They can help us to stay accountable to God. We can be like, you talking trash, what's up? You want to, oh, wait a minute. Oh, I got my Christian shirt on. I can't be fighting. I'll tell you what, let me go change. I'll be right back. But we remember, we're like, oh, that's right, I'm a Christian. Or maybe you got your WWJD and you're like, what would Jesus do? He would turn the other cheek. I'm going to turn the other cheek. It might be yours, but I'm going to turn it. No, I'm just kidding. We understand. We're like, oh, that's a reminder, man. That's right. I belong to God. See, we have those things even as Christians. We don't wear prayer shawls. I mean, get one if you want, I guess. We'll talk about the danger of that before we finish here in just a couple minutes. But those reminders that, oh, I belong to God. Verse 40, and that you may remember and do all my commandments and be holy for your God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. He's repeated it several times. This gives us an opportunity to finish with something that we don't oftentimes talk about our outward appearance. And there are a few biblical principles that I want to share with you about the clothing that we wear. By the way, all of you look lovely this morning. Even you guys. Just kidding. God is concerned, here's a biblical principle. God is concerned with the outward appearance of his people. I mean, he just told his people, listen, when you make your clothing, put some tassels on there. It needs to be visible. So he told his people that. Now, that's not required of us anymore. We don't have to have special clothing with tassels or any of those things. But the principle is that God is concerned with the outward appearance of his people. Do you guys think that I look really cool with this on? Should I just wear this every Sunday from now on? Yeah? Ah! No way, man. Biblical principle number 1, God is concerned with the outward appearance of his people. We just read about it But also in 1 Timothy 2, 9 and 10. He says, in like manner also, that the women, and all the guys are like, that's right, the women in their clothes. We'll get to you men in just a moment. But that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation. And then he says this, not with braided hair. Who's got braids in their hair? Brooke's got braids in her hair. Sinful. Do you have some too? You got one. Oh, shameful. No, it's not shameful. We'll talk about that in just a second. He says, modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing. You're like, man, grandma bought me this necklace. It's gold or whatever. I can't wear it. What are you saying? I can't wear it? That's not what he's saying. He's not saying that. And he's not saying that you can't braid your hair or that you can't wear pearls. Anybody like pearls? I know that's kind of like an old school thing, but right? Pearls are fantastic. Love pearls. Just kidding. Okay. What is he talking about here? Well, obviously he's concerned with the outward appearance of his people, and he's telling the ladies here specifically, your clothing, your apparel needs to be modest. It means humble, self-effacing, meaning not calling attention to yourself. Now that's hard, man. Because where do you and I live? Baby, we live in Cali, SoCal, right? Everybody wants to come to Cali. Palm trees and beaches and fashion. It's one of the things that we do. We're all about it, right? We got malls, mega malls, man, with just filled with clothes, man. We go in there, spend money on clothing. We love that. It's the idea is that, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to get me a fit that just, everybody's just going to, it's going to be jaw-dropping. Well, God is saying, listen, for the Christian, that shouldn't be our main focus. It's okay to look good. It's okay. And it's okay to buy some nice clothing. And it's okay if someone notices your clothing. There's nothing wrong with that. But the idea is that that ought not be my goal when I'm dressing. But he also mentions the word propriety. This means, I like this word propriety. Our clothing should be with a propriety. Decent, appropriate, and look at this, with regard for others. What? Yeah. Ladies, you got to be careful. Again, we live in SoCal, man, and you got the beach in SoCal, and if you go to the beach, you got to have a bikini, right? And we have a rule here with our youth group that we don't do bikinis for the girls. And what do we not do for the guys? Speedos, man. Some of you guys get into high school on the swim team or you're a water polo. I mean, I didn't do it, but I remember, seeing the guys in their little chonies, man. And it's like, but then it's like, oh, high school trip, I can show up in my, in my Speedos, It's like, man, you better save that for your European vacation, okay? But here, you got to wear the shorts or whatever. But it's not because, hey, man, bikinis are just so sinful and we're Christians and we're the church and you better not do it. We live in SoCal. You go to the beach, whether you're with the church or not, you're going to see bikinis. But what we want for you young ladies to understand is that at the church, there are guys there. And when you go to the beach, there are guys there. And I mean, these are some really holy guys that you have sitting around you. But they do have eyes. And they do have a mind. And that mind can go, and it just starts, man, the gears start turning. Also, you go to the beach, man, ladies, you need to understand there's a bunch of old perverts there. Look, I don't know. Some people, I love this word propriety because it means decent and appropriate, but it means with regard for others. So think about that. As a Christian, what kind of clothing am I wearing, and how does that affect the other people around me? Does that mean I should wear a nun, uniform? No, that's not what that means. Just be mindful is all. And then he says the clothing should also be in moderation. Self-control is what that means. Now, why does he say it to the women and not to the men? Because the men already dress like hobos. Yes or no? Ladies, can I get an amen? Right? Like, what is this man wearing? What are those, right? You're just like, what is, the guys are not really encouraged. There are some guys, but the guys are not really encouraged to dress with less or to dress provocatively. You young ladies are under constant assault, right? And some of you ladies are going to the store and you're like looking like, man, I just want something decent. And it's like, am I in the kids section? Like, where, excuse me, can you show me where the adult section is? Like, you're in it. Like, why did everything shrink? It's just less and less and less, right? And what they're trying to do is get you, it's like the more you show, the more love you'll get. That's not love you're getting, okay? So he didn't really need to say it to the guys because the ladies, even in the ancient world, were under constant assault to dress provocatively. And he says, for the Christian, you just got to be mindful. Notice he doesn't say, you better wear this and this and this and this uniform. He doesn't say that. He just says, I want you to think about these things. Verse 10, he says in 1 Timothy 2, 9 and 10, verse 10, he says, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. But there's another principle, and that is that God is more concerned with the inward than with the outward. So that if you showed up to the beach in a bikini, ladies, I'm not talking to the guys, okay, the ladies? But for the guys, you show up in a Speedo or whatever, guess what? God still loves you. And he loves you more than your clothing. And you can still have a pure heart. That is possible. So don't let me or anybody else put a trip on you. But God is more concerned with the inward than the outward. Luke 12:23, if you're taking notes. Life is more, Jesus said this, life is more than food and the body is more than clothing. There's more to life than fashion, food. In Colossians 3:12 and 13, Paul said, therefore, as the elect of God, the chosen of God, you're holy and beloved. He says, put on. That's the word endu. And the word is to clothe. He says, clothe yourself with tender mercies. See, that's not clothing. He's talking about the inward. Tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. Bearing with one another means you stand next to your brother or your sister and you hold them up and you help them get through a tough time. Bearing with one another, forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. That's better than the outward. 1 Peter 3:3. 1 Peter 3:3 and 4. Do not let your adornment be outward. Don't make that the main focus. Arranging the hair. Well, all of us arrange our hair. It's good to arrange our hair, right? Arranging the hair, wearing gold, putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart. God is more concerned with the inward. Let it be the hidden person of the heart with the incorruptible beauty, look at this, of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. If I open my Bible and it said God loves red socks, what would you and I do? We'd buy some red socks, right? We'd fill our drawer with red socks. Not Boston Red Sox, just red socks. But he doesn't say that. But we are told what God does love. What he finds precious, a gentle and quiet spirit. It's very precious in the sight of God. I need a gentle and quiet spirit. Sometimes I'm abrasive. Sometimes I'm too loud. Proverbs 31:25. How about that one? We're almost done. Almost done. Strength and honor are her clothing. She shall rejoice in time to come. You see the attention to the inward? Strength and honor are her clothing. Where'd it go? Proverbs 31:25. Strength and honor are her clothing. I feel like one of you ladies that's into fashion, that you should create a fashion line, clothing line called Strength and Honor. And then when you make your first $1 million, you should share some with me. Because I'm just a poor youth pastor. And I came up with the idea. Okay? Strength and honor are her clothing. In Proverbs 31, I love that. I love Proverbs. he says strength and honor are her clothing. But did you know a couple verses before that, it said about this same woman, she wears purple and fine linen. It's okay to dress nice, nothing wrong with that. But don't let that be the focus of your life. And finally, the third biblical principle here, attention to the outward more than the inward oftentimes leads to pride. Because if I'm like, hey man, I'm only paying attention to the outward, then I show up to church every Sunday with this thing, and what happens? What if I gave this to Joaquin? And then Joaquin used it every Sunday and he walked around the church. What would happen? What do you guys think would happen?
No one speaks for me.
What do you guys think would happen if he went walking around the church with this thing? Think anybody would notice? Duh, like everybody. And everybody would be coming up, oh, dude, let me check out your tassels. Shh. What is this? Oh, man, look at the gold on there. You know, and he would get all of the attention. And sometimes, if I'm only paying attention to the outward appearance, that more than I do the inward, that can lead to pride. Jesus said in Matthew 23, verse 5, talking about the Pharisees, he says, but all their works they do to be seen by people. They make their phylacteries. We'll talk about that at a later time, but it was a box on their head. They make their phylacteries broad. They make them big, and they enlarge the borders of their garments. You see, with enlarged borders, they can put more tassels. And people go, oh, man, you really pray a lot, huh? Look how big your borders are, man. All those tassels. We have to be careful. We can even get ourselves in trouble if, we decide that we're going to wear some Christian clothing. I got a Christian shirt or whatever, unashamed or whatever. And that can fill us with pride too. We've got to be careful because it might be like, oh, look, me, man, I'm really representing, man. Look at me. I'm really living for Christ. What about you? What are you doing? Oh, you don't even have a Christian shirt? Oh, come on. Are you ashamed? What? So we got to be careful. We got to be so careful with the outward appearance. Got to be mindful. We've got to use these biblical principles to say, okay, I just need to focus on the Lord, man, and I need to focus on my spiritual health, my spiritual life, more than the outward. Father, thank you so much for your word.